Have you ever stopped to think that your kindness, instead of being a positive force, might be ruining you? It may seem hard to believe, but often, the desire to please others and constantly help can lead you down a path of emotional and mental exhaustion. What should be a virtue turns into an invisible trap that slowly erodes your balance and inner peace. But don't worry, it's not too late to turn things around. In this video, we'll explore the 8 signs that your kindness is actually harming your life and, more importantly, how you can stop sabotaging your own well-being. Sometimes we give so much to others that we forget our own happiness needs care too. If you feel exhausted, frustrated, or even invisible, you might be giving too much without realizing it. Let's discover together how to recognize these signs and bring back the balance between giving and receiving, caring for others, and, above all, caring for yourself. Leave a comment below about how your kindness has impacted your life. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any transformative content. Sometimes, in the name of kindness, you lose yourself. The desire to please others, to always be available, to offer help without considering the consequences, can be a double-edged sword. In your eagerness to please, you may start forgetting who truly matters: you. Excessive kindness, though an admirable virtue, has the power to silence your own needs, turning the desire to help others into a burden you carry on your shoulders day after day. And you start to wonder, when did I stop taking care of myself? This vicious cycle of constantly trying to please can be more harmful than it seems. By being overly kind, you begin to stray from healthy boundaries, neglecting your mental and emotional health. What once seemed like a natural act of generosity now becomes an overwhelming burden, a constant demand to give without ever receiving what you truly need in return. The relentless pursuit of others' approval, the expectation of being recognized for your kindness, makes you forget that your happiness is also your responsibility. You're trying to solve everyone else's problems while ignoring your own. Remember that true kindness doesn't come from emotional exhaustion or self-depletion. It stems from balance, from knowing how to give and receive, from feeling good about what you do without expecting something in return, but also without sacrificing yourself. When you realize you're becoming an endless source for others but feel drained, tired, and exhausted, it's time to stop and reflect. We cannot be a candle that burns constantly to light others without caring to keep our own flame alive. And when you start noticing these signs, it's time to seek the balance that may have been lost along the way. Have you ever caught yourself helping someone and, deep down, felt a tightness in your chest? When kindness turns into personal sacrifice, it starts to lose its essence. And often, you lose yourself in the process, thinking you're being generous when, in reality, you're putting yourself in second place. This is one of the greatest dangers of excessive kindness. It can quickly become emotional self-sabotage disguised as altruism. You believe you're doing good, but in doing so, you lose connection with your own desires and needs, becoming, in a way, a prisoner of your own good intentions. The line between being kind and self-sabotaging is very thin. When you start saying yes to everything and everyone out of fear of disappointing others, you're unknowingly neglecting your own emotional balance. You become the fixer of other people's problems, but who fixes yours? Kindness turns into a game where others win, and you unintentionally lose. The consequences are subtle but profound. Exhaustion, frustration, and eventually a sense of emptiness. It's like being in a room full of people trying to please everyone, but at the end of the day feeling lonelier than ever. And that's where the real dilemma arises. Is what you consider kindness actually an act of self-sabotage? Could your need to be seen as a good person be distancing you from being the best version of yourself? Good intentions need healthy boundaries, a space where you preserve and strengthen yourself. Because true kindness isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about acting with wisdom, balancing care for others with care for yourself. When you recognize this boundary, you start to see that true kindness comes with deep respect for your own values and needs. There are moments when you look in the mirror and feel a certain disconnection from yourself. Something's not right, but you can't quite pinpoint what it is. You've been good to others, always offering help, listening, solving, but deep down, something is undermining your peace of mind. When kindness is unbalanced, it starts to take its toll, and the first sign is the silent stress that builds up inside you. It shows up in small actions, forced smiles, words spoken out of obligation, promises made without the real desire to follow through. Your peace of mind begins to slip away, and you find yourself more irritable, impatient, and lacking the energy needed to focus on what truly matters. The key to fixing this lies in recognizing your own limits. You start to realize that by trying to please others, you're drifting away from your own essence. True kindness doesn't require you to empty yourself to fill others. It requires you to be whole and complete before offering help. The first step to restoring your peace of mind is learning to say no with love. It's not about rejecting people, but about protecting yourself and ensuring your energy isn't drained by those unwilling to give back. Inner peace comes from the ability to balance giving with receiving, listening with speaking, helping with knowing when to be helped. When you start to understand this, your peace of mind returns. It comes back not as a luxury, but as a right you have to care for yourself. Unbounded kindness can lead to emotional exhaustion, but mindful kindness brings clarity, serenity, and a deep sense of fulfillment. Over time, you learn to distinguish between a genuine act of generosity and an externally imposed expectation. In this process, kindness becomes an act of self-care, and your inner peace becomes unshakable. Because, in the end, true kindness begins when you take care of yourself first and find balance between your needs and others. Have you ever wondered if you're letting people take advantage of your kindness? At first, it seems like a simple gesture, an act of generosity. But over time, your kindness starts to create a pattern in your personal and professional relationships. Those you constantly help may begin to expect the same from you without acknowledging or valuing what you give. And then, without meaning to, you find yourself in a cycle where you're giving more than you receive. This weakens relationships, turning what should be a mutual exchange of support into dependency, where your generosity becomes an obligation rather than a choice. This behavior isn't exclusive to personal life. In professional settings, kindness can also be manipulated. You start doing favors, helping with projects without being asked, always trying to please others and prove your worth. However, without clear boundaries, your kindness becomes a vulnerability. And instead of being admired for your generosity, you start being seen as someone who can be easily overburdened. In the long run, this dynamic undermines respect and reciprocity in relationships. Kindness without healthy boundaries loses its value, and what should be a noble gesture turns into silent emotional exhaustion. Healthy relationships are built on reciprocity, and when you're giving too much without receiving, you start to feel invisible. You become a pillar for others, but no one is there when you need help. This creates an emotional disconnection that can be hard to repair. The secret lies in learning to say no assertively, with respect and care. Kindness doesn't need to be sacrificed, but it must be balanced with recognition of your own limits and needs. When you learn to cultivate healthy boundaries, your relationships become stronger, more genuine, and longer-lasting. Often you find yourself making mistakes without realizing it, thinking you're just being a kind person. But the truth is, in many situations, you're sabotaging yourself, doing things that harm your emotional health and balance. The first common mistake is trying to solve everyone else's problems, even if it means putting your own problems aside. Kindness becomes an excuse to avoid dealing with your own feelings and responsibilities. And so, you lose yourself, wear yourself out, while trying to save others from their battles. True generosity becomes genuine when you give yourself permission to care for yourself too. Another mistake many make is failing to set clear boundaries. You often believe that being kind means saying yes to everything without stopping to evaluate whether it's truly necessary or if you have the emotional capacity for it. This can lead to immense overwhelm, where in the end, you feel exhausted, resentful, and even guilty for not meeting others' expectations. The mistake here is a lack of discernment, of knowing when to say no. Saying no isn't selfish, it's an act of self-care. Your mental and emotional health need room to breathe, and that only happens when you learn to say no with clarity and firmness. A third mistake is the belief that you need to be perfect in your kindness. The pressure to always be available, always ready to help, can become such a heavy burden that you start losing yourself along the way. Perfection isn't the key to being genuinely kind. In fact, true kindness comes from understanding that you're human, with limitations and flaws. When you try to be perfect, you create unrealistic expectations for yourself and others. Kindness should be a natural choice, not an obligation. When you let go of perfection, you create space to be more authentic, more compassionate, and, paradoxically, kinder. Sometimes you realize something's wrong but can't quite identify what it is. The feeling of emotional exhaustion, of always giving without receiving, starts to intensify. Your friends and family, who used to be sources of joy, now seem to demand more and more from you. Excessive kindness, when uncontrolled, can lead to emotional burnout. It's as if you're constantly putting yourself at the back of the line while others take the front. At first, this may seem altruistic, but over time, it turns into a burden. And the worst part, you don't realize it until you're completely drained. Another clear sign that your kindness is harming you is the loss of joy in helping. The act of being kind, which once brought satisfaction and fulfillment, starts to feel like an obligation, a daunting task. You no longer feel inspired to help, but feel like you're just playing a role imposed by others or yourself. The joy and pleasure of helping others turn into an empty exchange, leaving you feeling increasingly empty inside. At this point, it's important to stop and reflect. Has your kindness become a trap? Is helping others actually harming your emotional health? Recovering balance begins with deep reflection on what you've been giving and what you've been receiving. If you've been constantly giving, it's time to step back and take a break. Kindness doesn't need to be abandoned, but it must be practiced with balance. One of the most important steps is learning to recognize when kindness becomes harmful. From there, understand how your own boundaries must be respected. Self-care isn't selfishness. It's a necessity. When you start giving yourself space for your own emotions and needs, you create a cycle of reciprocity where both you and others can benefit from your genuine kindness without it becoming a burden. Kindness is one of the most powerful virtues, but like any virtue, it can become toxic when not practiced with wisdom. Imagine you're a tree, bearing fruit for everyone around you but never tending to your own roots. You start to feel weaker, without energy, while others benefit from your generosity. Kindness becomes toxic when it demands more from you than you can give. The signs are subtle, but you start noticing physical exhaustion, mental stress, and a loss of connection with your own purpose. When this happens, kindness becomes a trap. It's no longer a source of joy, but of depletion. Another sign that your kindness has become toxic is the feeling of devaluation. You start to notice that no matter how much you give, there's no real reciprocity. You give, but you don't receive the recognition you deserve. And the most dangerous part, you start accepting this lack of appreciation, thinking that's just how things are supposed to be. True kindness should be a genuine exchange, where care for yourself and others is balanced. When you feel the scales are tipped and you're constantly giving without receiving, your emotional health begins to suffer. You feel invisible, as if you're sacrificing yourself for something that no longer brings emotional or spiritual return. Change begins when you recognize that, to be truly kind, you must first take care of yourself. Kindness shouldn't be a demand, but a spontaneous choice from the heart, not obligation. The first step to restoring balance is setting boundaries. You need to know how to say no when your energy is at its limit so that the yes you give is genuine. By doing this, you protect yourself from becoming a victim of your own kindness. When you choose to prioritize yourself, your kindness transforms into a renewing force, capable of benefiting both you and others. Kindness then ceases to be toxic and becomes a reflection of emotional health and self-respect. Have you ever stopped to reflect on your kindness? Sometimes it may seem like an unquestionable virtue, but the truth is that being overly kind can be a disguised trap. Excessive kindness can make you ignore your own needs, put yourself in second place, and often even emotionally exhaust yourself. You believe you're doing good, but without realizing it, you're harming yourself. When you give without limits, you lose the ability to say no, creating a void within you because you're constantly giving to others without replenishing your own energy. This is the first warning sign. Kindness, which starts as a genuine choice, becomes an endless obligation. Another clear sign of excessive kindness is mental and emotional exhaustion. You start to feel tired, anxious, and, in many cases, even irritated. Your mind, once focused and calm, is now overwhelmed with others' expectations and your own insecurities. The relentless pursuit of pleasing others can, unintentionally, become a burden that affects your mental health. Altruism, when practiced excessively, can leave you emotionally drained without the strength to connect with your own feelings. The feeling of being used starts to settle in, but at the same time, you don't know how to stop this cycle. It's important to understand that excessive kindness isn't a sign of strength, but of a need for external approval. You lose yourself in pleasing others, not realizing that true generosity begins with self-love. Kindness doesn't need to be a daunting task. It should come naturally, with the understanding that you can't give what you don't have. When you learn to cultivate love and respect for yourself, kindness becomes a true choice, not a need for validation. And by recognizing this cycle, you start to restore balance in your life, allowing yourself to be genuinely kind without losing your essence. How many times have you set aside your own dreams and needs to help others? Genuine kindness should be a balanced exchange, where you care for yourself and others with equal devotion. However, the impulse to please or always be available for others often makes you lose yourself. Constantly putting others ahead of yourself may seem noble, but it's a path that leads to emotional exhaustion. By neglecting your own desires and mental health, you create an unsustainable cycle of self-forgetting, where you give everything and receive little or nothing in return. In doing so, you drift away from your own essence, becoming a version of yourself that no longer feels like you. This behavior is fueled by the belief that others need you, a mindset that's often more about filling an internal void than genuine altruism. You start to identify with the role of savior, but in return, you lose connection with yourself. The problem is that by living for others, you end up emptying yourself, unable to hear your own needs and ignoring your own happiness. This imbalance in relationships creates fertile ground for resentment because you start to feel overwhelmed but lack the courage to set necessary boundaries. Self-care is seen as selfish when, in reality, it's essential for you to continue offering kindness in a healthy way. To change this scenario, the first step is realizing that you have the right to be a priority in your own life. True kindness begins with practicing self-care, listening to yourself, and understanding that you can't help anyone if you're empty inside. Setting healthy boundaries doesn't mean abandoning others, but ensuring you have space to grow, care for yourself, and strengthen. Remember, there's nothing wrong with putting your needs first, because by doing so, you become a more balanced person, capable of offering what truly matters. Genuine kindness, without sacrifices or resentment. Have you ever felt like you're giving more than you can? Kindness, when practiced without limits, starts to turn into an act of self-sacrifice, where you constantly give to others and forget yourself. This behavior may seem noble and altruistic at first, but over time, it begins to destroy your emotional and physical balance. By trying to please everyone, you start to lose yourself in the process, not realizing that your energy is slowly draining. The lack of care for your own needs creates an empty space within you, leaving you feeling exhausted, unmotivated, and often resentful. This is the first sign that you're giving too much, the loss of your own balance. Unbounded kindness makes you feel overwhelmed with others' expectations, and worse, you start creating unrealistic expectations of yourself. You believe you must always be available, always help, always be the one to fix everything. This, of course, leads to exhaustion, stress, and frustration. There's nothing wrong with being kind, but you need to know when to stop, step back, and recharge. You start to realize that by giving too much, you're becoming a shadow of yourself, a version that lives for others without living for yourself. The secret lies in recognizing when giving becomes a burden and understanding that, to be genuinely kind, you also need to give yourself the care you deserve. Reversing this scenario starts with the awareness that balance is key. You can be a kind person, but you need to learn to make yourself a priority in your own life. By setting clear boundaries, you give yourself permission to breathe, rest, and renew. Kindness doesn't need to be a burden, but a conscious and balanced choice. When you learn to give wisely, knowing when to give and when to step back, kindness becomes a source of positive and transformative energy. And by restoring balance, you can offer others true kindness without harming your own mental or emotional health. Now that you've recognized the signs that your kindness may be harming your balance, the real transformation begins. Remember, being kind doesn't mean sacrificing yourself or losing yourself to please others. It means taking care of yourself, setting healthy boundaries, and learning to say no when necessary. If you commit to prioritizing your happiness and well-being, you'll see that true kindness becomes an act of balance and self-care, not depletion. So, stop and reflect. How can you balance your kindness without harming yourself? What can you do, starting today, to restore your well-being? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Let's create a space for personal growth and true generosity together. And if you want to continue this journey of transformation, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to not miss any videos.